Greetings. I'm dr.chan, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. My next guest is Dr. Iain McGilchrist. He is a writer, scholar, and psychiatrist. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, former Oxford literary scholar, and author of the groundbreaking books The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, and more recently his two-volume book The Matter with Things. Dr. McGilchrist was elected as a fellow at All Souls College at 21 years old and was further re-elected 2 more times. He went on to train as a psychiatrist, taking on position of clinic director at BEnthlem Royal and Maudsley Hospital in London. He trained in many units, including becoming a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins. In today's dialogue, we begin by discussing the divided brain, further highlighting how and why the left hemisphere has become more dominant in our culture and why that is an issue. We focus on particular cognitive functions such as language and attention to further illustrate their differences and importance between hemispheres. Finally, we plunge into a deep conversation about moral intuitionism, consciousness, asymmetry, truth, beauty, goodness, values, and conscience. We end with a series of fun rapid-fire questions to gain a greater appreciation of who Dr. Iain McGilchrist is as a person. Feel free to skip around if any of these topics are of interest to you. So your first book, The Master and His Emissary, is really a play on a tale from the work of Nietzsche, where the right hemisphere corresponds to the master, the left hemisphere to the emissary, right? And building on this narrative, Western society has evolved in such a way that it's now in favor of the left hemisphere, supplanting the rightful place of the right hemisphere. And to my understanding, this is a travesty because the right hemisphere really does have much more to offer. And it's become more of a dangerous world if the left hemisphere is to really fully take over. So my first question for you is, how do the priorities and values of the right and left hemisphere differ in such a way that would lead you to that conclusion?
Yes, thank you. I suppose the first thing I should say very briefly is just that if you haven't been following developments in this area, you probably believe that there's nothing in the stories of hemisphere difference. It's all pop psychology that was exploded about 30, 40 years ago. But that's just that we got things slightly wrong, as one does in science when one starts out trying to work out what these differences are. And so going to values is a very interesting way of looking at it, because the hemispheres have different evolutionary roles, if you like. The reason we have 2 hemispheres, and all the creatures that we know have brains have 2 hemispheres, why we have them is that we need to be able to pay attention to the world in 2 different ways. Briefly, the left hemisphere in order to focus on a detail, in order to grab it deftly, quickly, and use it, and the right hemisphere for understanding the whole of the rest of the picture, looking out for predators and kin and so on. So from that, but quite a long way from that starting point, one can see that the purposes of the hemispheres and the things that they respond to are going to be different. And the single purpose of the left hemisphere is to be able to do this business of getting things, grabbing them, amassing them, using them. And so important is that half of our brain is really set aside for dealing with this need. The difficulty there is that all the other things that are in the world and the other purposes that we might have in the world are left uncovered by the left hemisphere's kind of attention, which is a predatory kind of attention. It's attention to a detail that one wants to get. And this means that the right hemisphere is open to, first of all, open to what it may find. It doesn't have preconceptions in the same way that the left hemisphere has preconceptions, certainly not to the same degree that the left hemisphere has. And it should be pointed out, I think, that the left hemisphere is simply less good at understanding the world if I'm right, that the division of the hemispheres is in service of a need to keep one part of the brain vigilant, taking a sustained, open picture of what there is in the world, and the other one being, as it were, attracted to and in need of homing in on a detail, then they're going to have different capacities. And what I show in the first part of the matter with things is that the left hemisphere is less good at all of the ways in which we might get information about the world. Its attention, its perceptions, its judgments, its emotional and social intelligence, indeed its cognitive intelligence, and its ability to think flexibly, what we call creativity. All of these are less good in the left hemisphere than in the right. So we've got a situation in which the left hemisphere is doing this all-important thing of keeping us alive by fulfilling our needs, but the right hemisphere is keeping us alive by watching out for all the rest. And I came to see values as one of the very important ways in which they differ. So the right hemisphere is seeing a whole picture, a whole society, a whole world, is attracted by things that we also value other than mere utility, things like the qualities of somebody who is loyal, who is honest, who is brave, who is faithful. But above that, things like goodness, beauty, and truth. And I say at the summit of them all is the holy. And in this, I'm following the early 20th century phenomenological philosopher Max Scheler, who had a pyramid of values. And the most basic value was that of pleasure or utility. But above that came the values of life, as he called them, and then these spiritual or intellectual values, beauty, goodness, and truth, and then the sacred. And the interesting thing is that for me, you can see that the left hemisphere is largely restricted to this business of utility. And all the higher levels of value, in as much as they're recognized at all, are explained as contributing to utility. Whereas for the right hemisphere, it sees actually it's aware of the power, the attractive power of these very important higher values. And indeed, utility is in the service of them. Because after all, as Lessing pointed out in the 18th century, for the utilitarian, there's a problem. If your value is use, the next question is useful for what? And if your answer is just further use, you're really, the thing is pointless. So there's got to be something more than just being useful. And therefore, but the left hemisphere is not aware of what that something else is. It's the right hemisphere that contributes it. Now, I argue in the Master and His Emissary, and probably to a greater extent and over a longer stretch in the matter with things, that our world is one in which we have ceased to pay attention to what the left hemisphere knows compared with the right. And this is important for values. It's important for purposes, because our purposes are not just those of mechanical utility, but are to do with things that have meaning for us. And they often have meaning for reasons that the left hemisphere can't really grasp. They're things that are best not made explicit. They're things like religious faith, love, great art, even sex. All these things change their nature when they're made explicit and really depend on being embodied where they are. So if I say that broadly, that sort of sets a picture for answering your question of why this is important and what the difference is.
So I was actually had a more technical question, because there is, as you call it, an ontological asymmetry, right? The sort of primacy of the right hemisphere and information flow going from right hemisphere to left hemisphere back to right hemisphere for humans on average. How does the left hemisphere become dominant? Is it like a collective degree to which the left hemisphere starts to inhibit, right hemisphere activation, or how do you characterize that?
Well, at the neurophysiological level, it just happens to be the case that the right hemisphere communicates more and more promptly with the left hemisphere than the left hemisphere does with the right. But I think what you may be asking is, how does it come about that this more important, more insightful, more intelligent, and more imaginative vision of the world offered by the right hemisphere comes to lose out to the rather
Yeah.
intellectually simple, ethically barren, imaginatively impoverished vision of the world? And I think there are, quite a few reasons, really. I've traced them in the Master and His Emissary as having happened 3 times in the West. And people sometimes ask me, well, why didn't you deal with the East? And there's 2 reasons for that. It's not that I don't think the East is important, it's just that I know very, very much less about its history than I do about that of the West. And the book was already becoming very long, and it would have become even longer if I'd tried to take in the history of the East. But coming back to the history of the West, one can see that several times a civilization, in the case of the Greeks, in the case of the Romans, in the case of our own at the time of the Renaissance, began with a wonderful working together of the 2 hemispheres, complementing one another and using one another to build in the arts, but also in science, and in society and politics, in the constructing of a human world, very richly, very imaginatively, and in a way that has enduring appeals, so that we look back to these ages as, in a way, the great ages of the West. But in every case, things began to give way, and I show in some degree of detail signs that the right hemisphere is ceding to the left hemisphere's take. And I think that this is partly because a civilization overreaches itself. It becomes too big and too unwieldy, and is trying to maintain power over and influence too big an area, and therefore requires sets of rather inflexible principles that are applied overall rather than sensitively applied to individual cases. I think, the feeling that we can become rich and powerful by using this left hemisphere, even if it means we become stupid and probably in the end destroy our civilization. I'm afraid that immediate lure of power is great enough to blind us to other things. But I think there are other things that happen. I mean, one is that, again, when the society gets bigger, much of the discourse is not done face to face, with individuals talking to individuals in relatively manageable social groups, below the Dunbar number of about 130. But when you have societies that consist of literally millions of people, and you're communicating with them, you have to do this in ways that are relatively unsubtle. They have to be in persuasive language, first of all, and most of the really important things don't convey their importance to us through language. So, for example, the natural world impresses itself on those who live in it, whose lives are governed by the seasons and cycles of it. The religious world is part of society, part of ritual, part of myth, part of worship together. And so in older societies, these things spoke to people of things that are diminished when they're turned into the everyday language that you have to use to write a manual for a piece of machinery. And so as societies get bigger, not only do they get cruder and more power hungry, but the discourse becomes cruder, becomes much simpler. And it's much easier to put across the position of the left hemisphere, which is just, it's all very simple. It's all just bits of stuff bumping into one another, and then occasionally they get together and make something bigger, and we know it all, we can understand it all. But I would say wisdom is when we realize how very little we do understand, that all the things that really matter to us can't be subjected to this kind of primitive calculus. So those are a few reasons. I think also what happens is that bureaucracies begin to become more and more important, and bureaucracies have very rigid schematic ways of thinking, that power structures attract to them people whose natural way of thinking is more left hemispheric and less imaginative, and they become the people
Mm,
who rule our lives, and so on and so forth.
mm.
In the introduction to the second edition of The Matter with Things, I talk about this and list, I think, 6 or 7 reasons.
Right. You know, it's interesting to think about these different cycles in a sense of creation and destruction, and what brings those together is this idea of transformation. Um, Now, when I think of hemispheric lateralization, and of course, as a neuropsychologist, I can't help but think about the famous split brain studies for which Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize. And the idea of the left hemisphere interpreter in particular from Gazzaniga, I always think is underemphasized in the literature. Just the fact that the left hemisphere will make up verbal responses to things that the right hemisphere sees. It has to make you pause and wonder, right? Like how much of my narratives are completely false, and how many times have these narratives overridden some of my gut feelings, or right hemisphere nonverbal language as it expresses itself to me, and it's said always with such conviction as it's reported, right? Which also is a great example of how confidence and accuracy don't necessarily have to correlate with one another.
No, that's right. Um, there's the famous Dunning-Kruger principle that the less you know, the more you think you know, and the more you know, the less you're aware of how little you know. Um,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
yes, and there's 2 things here. The left hemisphere confabulates, and that's, of course, what you're referring to, that when it doesn't know the answer to something, it makes up something plausible. What's interesting is that I see AI as an externalization on a massive scale of the way of operating of the left hemisphere, and not
mm,
of the right hemisphere. Which is a further danger for us. But it's fascinating that Chat GPT makes stuff up if it doesn't know things and confidently says that this is the case when there's no evidence
right.
for it. So there's
Mm-hmm,
there's confabulation, but there's something even more important, which is delusion. So the left hemisphere is frankly delusional on its own, and
mm-hmm,
you and I know what delusions are, and I'm using it in a technical sense. So most of the delusional syndromes, and I look at about 30 of them very early on in The Matter with Things, almost all of them, all bar one, I think, are
mm-hmm,
more common when the damage is to the right hemisphere than to the left. And the effect can be
mm-hmm,
very extreme. I mean, it's almost always, for many of these syndromes, the right hemisphere that has sustained an injury or an insult of some kind, and is therefore not contributing to the picture of reality, and hence people become deluded. So it's very important that the left hemisphere is not, as people used to say in the bad old days of hemisphere difference pop psychology, is not reliable. It
yeah,
is not unemotional. Its problem is not that it's just a bit
mm-hmm,
boring, but thoroughly dependable. It's not dependable.
mm,
It's
right.
likely to lead us astray. It makes stuff up. It believes things that are impossible, and it's
Mm-hmm,
also adamant that it is right.
right. Now, this is a different bit of a twist here, but I wanted to hear your opinion on this. So, humans are required, as you say, to be fully present, right? And that tends to be, as you mentioned in the book, lateralized to the right hemisphere, as well as be able to suspend the immediacy of space and time to develop this necessary detachment, right? And that allows us to better plan and to analyze a situation. Now, this is more frontal involvement and also more left hemispheric involvement, and my next book is actually on the dialogue between Taoist themes and science. And you actually, to give you benefit here, because you said you didn't write anything about the East, you did have a bit on the East and a discussion about how it's more right-brained in general. But in any case, going back to this, one of the important ideas in Taoism is the idea that we've become misaligned with nature. And a part of the issue now is that we experience ourselves as isolated from nature, isolated in our minds and separate from it, even though we know that we are an interconnected being and a part of nature. Now, connecting these two sort of ideas, do you think that this frontal left hemisphere function that has enabled us strategic advantages have possibly also created this experience of separation?
I think a number of things have gone to it, and certainly the necessary establishment of what I call actually necessary distance runs the risk that if it becomes a sense of separation, which is really a travesty of what is involved, then of course that can be harmful. We do need both to be engaged with the world and yet not completely subsumed and swallowed up in it. So we need to have a degree of distance enough to enable us to see what it is we're dealing with, but not so much that we become estranged from it. And one of the problems we have nowadays is distinguishing between a distinction and a division. So things need to be distinguished from one another, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they are ultimately divided from one another. They may simply be preserving their distinct nature. And a simple way of thinking of this is like two heavenly bodies that are circling one another. It won't do well if the attraction is so great they crash into one another. And the situation can't endure if the attraction is so weak that they fly apart. And a similar point can be made about stable human relationships. They require this necessary distance, which I liken to the distance that is required in order to read something. Too far away, you can't read it at all, but if it's too close, you can't make it out. So we need these things. And I think that, as far as I'm concerned, this is the main function of the frontal lobes, both left and right, to introduce this element to the activities of both those hemispheres. But you raise also the very interesting question of the separation from nature and the importance of closeness to and a faithful following of nature, following the Tao. And for 50 years, I have actually been a Taoist. So Taoism may or may not. I think I talk about it a lot more in my more recent book, The Matter with Things, which indeed has a great deal more to say about spiritual traditions of the East and of the West. And indeed of other places, of indigenous peoples in different parts of the world. So what is interesting about them is that they often show remarkable insights into the relationship between the hemispheres, intuitive insights. So let us just think a bit about the relationship with nature and what has alienated us from it. Well, one thing, of course, is the Industrial Revolution. And this has drawn people away from their roots where they'd often been for thousands of years in small communities in rural settings, to big cities where they were often, for the first time, truly poor. And this divorced them from the normal promptings of nature. And hence, I think there was a big interest in, through art, through poetry, through painting, and so on, of trying to recapture some of that connection with nature that is part of our being. And I'd like to make a further point, which is I think that there is actually nothing less than a war on nature going on at the moment. I think that there are a number of different aspects to this, but one that's worth drawing attention to is that effectively the left hemisphere is very inward looking in the sense that it comes up with a schema, it comes up with a diagram, a map, or a plan of the world, which it then refers back to. So inside the left hemisphere's abstracted world, everything refers to things that it has already come up with. Whereas the right hemisphere is much more open to experience. So the right hemisphere is saying, well, it's a good theory, but let's look out of the window and see whether actually life is like that. And I think at the moment, theory is very much trumping intuition, imagination, and our sense of what is real. So we're being asked to ignore things that are very deeply important, that we know are right, but we're being told that some theory says that they're wrong. And I think this is part of a war on what we ourselves have not created. And this is partly because nature and things we have not created form a kind of rebuff to human hubris, to human pride, to human arrogance, the belief that we can do anything. And you see it followed out very obviously in the craze for trying to prolong life unreasonably, perhaps even to freeze people and be able to bring them back to life so that they can potentially live eternally. I think this is a complete fantasy. I think it could be a horrible mistake. But in any case, I think what it expresses to me is a distrust of the body, a distrust of nature, a utilization of both for the needs of the left hemisphere. And we find ourselves subjugated. We're like subjects of a tyrant. And in other words, what has happened is that the master, who was a wise figure, and who understood the big picture, the right hemisphere, has given way to a peremptory, arrogant second in command who thinks he knows the whole story, but is in fact almost ignorant of everything important. And that's, I believe, where we now dangerously stand.
Right. It's several thoughts came to mind as you were talking. One of which is just the idea of, in your book, The Master and His Emissary, you do track how changes in artistic movements reflect left and right hemisphere changes, right? Like left, I think you related to modernism, right to the Renaissance. But we also find this in popular music today, right? Especially with this necessity for, or a lot of music revolving around being capable of doing everything and anything, especially embedded in the lyrics, which is a big change from a lot of the popular music from history. The other thing that came to mind was Sir Arthur Conan O'Doyle, right? Twisting theories to suit facts as opposed to, or twisting facts to suit theories as opposed to twisting theories to suit facts, right? And the failure to do so. And then, another thing that you mentioned that something came to mind was the fact that, one of the things I really like about your work is the existence of several creative angles on conventional ideas. Like when you speak about language, right? You share that maybe it's not just about communication, but it's maybe even before that about the development of symbols that allows us to better map the world and navigate within it. But then that, of course, creates this conceptual world now that is going to be layered on top of this perceptual world. And it's like you say, self-referring, which is even seen in some of the cortical columns, right? Now, the one thing I wanted to hear more about from your book, and then we're going to move to your next book, is metaphors. You had a lot of interesting things to say about metaphors, and I wanted to just hear you share whatever's on your mind about that.
Yes. Well, in the Master and His Emissary, there's a chapter called Language, Truth and Music, which is a pun for philosophers who know the work of A.J. Ayer called Language, Truth and Logic, which used to be very influential. And my point is that language probably originates in music, so that musical sounds, which are highly expressive of an inner state, animals are able to communicate in this way very effectively, as we know. And there are indeed peoples in the world who, over long distances while hunting, can send by whistling or singing messages that have very specific meaning. So this is probably the beginnings of language. And language is therefore at one remove from reality because the symbol is just that. It's not the thing. It's a sound that substitutes for a thing when you start having a language. So when this is just musical communication, you're communicating a whole feeling about things, and as it becomes more and more specific, you're communicating concepts. And one of the ways in which language works is to map the world so that we can move ideas about, connect them, and so forth. But metaphors are the basis of all language. The point is this, that people who perhaps haven't considered very much about the nature of metaphor, if asked about it, will say, well, it's something that happens in poetry, and it's a kind of a form of art. It's a decorative touch in which things are made to be likened and so on. But this is really to put the cart before the horse, because metaphor is not an embellishment on the top of language. Metaphor is the basis of all language. So when we come to look at even very abstract words, such as abstract itself, it comes from Latin roots, which mean literally to drag something away from the context in which it should be understood. And even words like immaterial go back to a word which originated with the word the mother, mater, and came to be connected with wood, and then with material, and then immaterial, of course, is an inverse. So even the words we use to describe the most abstract things are in fact based in metaphors. And metaphor is where your meaning bottoms out, if you like. You cannot get lower than that metaphor which connects you to the experience that is being metaphorically conveyed. And most of what we do has this nature. So music, you see, is also deeply metaphorical. When one feels the music rising and certain things happening, you can feel in your body metaphorical shapes and things moving your body and having an effect on your body, of course, in many other ways as well. But experience has this nature, and rituals, which we're now beginning to realize now that we've trashed them and discarded them, are actually very important and very powerful. Also are forms of embodied metaphors. So metaphor is where real meaning lies, and it's worth just commenting on the difference between a word that's related, which is myth, and logic, because in ancient Greece there were two ways in which you could reach the truth, and originally these were known as muthos or mythos and logic, and muthos was considered the greater of the two. It was the one that dealt with the really big truths that couldn't be just conveyed in simple terms. So, you know, the nature of the gods, the nature of nature itself, what human beings are, and all these sort of things. So that is where myths helped us to understand ourselves and to understand our situation and to understand the cosmos that we arise out of. And logic was a sort of pettifogging kind of fringe thing that was used by lawyers in court to decide how much money should be owed to somebody. And we now come to a situation where logic is considered infallible, which it is not, and myth is considered a synonym for a lie, which it profoundly is not. So we've inverted the meaning of these words. And there's something else to say about logic when I say that it's not infallible. It is quite true that logic is very, very important. Reason is something that we're actually losing at the moment. And one of the things that distresses me is that in much of the rhetoric that now rules our lives, people have let go of being reasonable. The things they say are not reasonable. They're neither rational nor reasonable, and I think there's a distinction to be made there. So it's very important, but nonetheless, it can lead you astray. So, for example, something close to our worlds are mental illnesses, and in an obviously delusional one such as schizophrenia. As G.K. Chesterton said, the madman is not somebody who's lost his reason, as people used to say, but has lost everything but his reason. So he no longer has imagination or intuition. So instead, he substitutes reason. So he's in the room and he hears a voice, and there's nobody in the room. He's quite clear about that. So where is this voice coming from? It must be coming from that socket, because it's the only place in the room where something can come in. So somebody is using the electrical system of the house to communicate messages to me. And it's logical, but it's completely bonkers. And and at the same time, I'm afraid there are a lot of irresponsible psychologists going around the place being paid large sums to go into organizations and tell people how they shouldn't listen to their intuitions. But in fact, intuitions are incredibly important for arriving at truths. They're much more subtle than any
Mm-hmm.
form of explicit reasoning. I'm not saying that explicit reasoning
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have its place. It very much does. And in writing long books,
Mm-hmm.
I've exercised it, of course. But intuitions are also very important to respect, because in an intuition, you can bring together 5, 8, 10, 12 different strands of thought, of information, from experience, from the ways in which you can build up a picture of what is likely here, and they can help guide one. And of course, there are instances where intuitions are wrong, but they're the flip side of why the intuitions are good. Just as the instance I gave of where reasoning leads you astray is really just the flip side of the fact that reasoning is usually very helpful.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, recently I did some a big review on intuition actually, and its work, and specifically moments in which it can be efficacious, and other times that it's not so beneficial. And usually for more complex and uncertain situations, intuition seems to win out. Now, there's
Yes.
also the question of moral intuitionism, which is slightly different, which I think is really fascinating. That's very fascinating to me, at least. They've done these studies with even with rats, where I don't know if you've read this one. It's by Bartol and their colleagues, but they basically like had one rat that was in a trap that was squealing and trying to get out, and it was in the center of a large space. Rats are afraid of running into open space, and they dropped another rat to see if it would free this rat from the trap. And the majority of rats, 23 out of 30 of them, would free the trapped rat and risk its own life. And then they
Yes.
created an even more complex situation where they had the chips. They added chocolate chips to see, well, now there's more incentive for this rat to run free and perhaps ignore the screaming rat that's freaking out, and eat some of these chips on its own. But at the end of the day, the majority of them saves the rat and ends up sharing the chips. And of course, the likelihood of saving the rat is if they have themselves been stuck in the trap. And so it's really interesting. And now they have these studies with
It
infants
is.
that are pre-verbal, showing that morality is not just a social
Yeah.
construct. And yeah, what are
It
your thoughts
isn't.
to that?
Well, and also there was an interesting, rather harrowing but nonetheless interesting experiment done in the 60s with monkeys that were in adjacent cages. And one monkey
Mm,
was starved for 3 days. And so it was absolutely
mm,
desperate for food. And it could access
mm,
food. But the only way it could access
mm,
it was by giving an electric shock to the other monkey. And it refused to
mm,
do it. It preferred to starve than to do this vile thing to this other creature. And so, yes, many creatures that we know of are willing to help not just members of their own species, but members of another species
mm,
altogether. So none of
mm,
the things that we were told that it's just about survival of the species and so on are right. But no, I think
mm.
morality is very deep. And although
Yeah,
there can be cultural differences in the emphasis that are put on certain acts in different cultures. Generally, the moral core is the same, that in most cultures, the things that we think are wrong and bad are thought to be wrong and bad. So,
yeah. I think another important idea that I wanted to touch on is attention. Attention as a moral act, and I know others have shown interest in this because it's such a profound idea. And when it comes to attention, well, number one, it's attention defined as how the world comes into being for us. I think that's an important step to share first, and then attention as a moral act. And when I think about attention, of course, again, given what I do, the first thing I think of is hemispatial neglect, which may occur if someone has a stroke in their right parietal lobe, and even though the visual system is fine, the individual can't attend to the left visual field, and as a result, it doesn't come into being for them, right? And in a neuropsych evaluation, we might give them the clock test, where they only draw half of the clock, or a line bisection task. They're only bisecting only half the page, and so on and so forth. Could you elaborate some of your thoughts on that?
yes, indeed. Well, first of all, I suppose before turning to attention as a moral act, I'd just like to make the point that
Mm-hmm.
one of the ways in which people are taught to think about morality nowadays in university departments of philosophy is utilitarianism. And that is actually very typical of left hemisphere function, because the left hemisphere really only understands things as useful or not.
Right.
And the odd thing about it is that utilitarianism involves attending to human situations in a way which is archetypally amoral or immoral, in fact. So,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
to allow your emotions to be part of your response, but instead to stand back in a kind of psychopathic way, calculating, well, if I do this and kill that person, then the idea that you should be killing people is not allowed to obtrude in this if you can save, lives at the end of the day. Now, there's not nothing in utilitarianism, but I argue about this in the towards the end of the Matter with Things. I think that there is an important distinction to be made between different philosophies of morality, and I don't favor utilitarianism. I favor it least of all the
Right.
alternatives. But coming to attention as a
Hey,
moral,
let me
sorry,
sorry.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
let me just interject because thought I don't want it to the thought to evade me again. Just in relationship to what you said, especially nowadays, with attention is literally the source of marketing and exploitation, right? The idea of attention as a moral act, to me at least, it gave me power or gave me back power, and I feel like could give other people power, especially because it makes you pause and makes you think, how am I distributing my attention? And it makes me think of the quote from William James, which is, each of us literally chooses by ways of attending to things what sort of universe, he shall appear to inhabit. And it's this
Mm.
idea of, again, how do I distribute my attention, and is there a way I can do so that would bring me more value to my actual life?
It certainly is, and the thing is that, well, this is a lot that could be said here, but let me try and compress it. First of all, I, I don't believe that there is simply a world out there that is the same as anything that, if it's attended to or not attended to, that whatever that is, it's changed when it's attended to. So what I'm saying is there is an encounter. I'm not saying we make up reality. I want to position myself orthogonally to two positions that I think are wrong. One is naive idealism, that because we do enter into the reality that we experience, some of us goes into making that reality, that we make it all up. That is completely illicit extension of that idea. But it's also
I agree
illicit
with
to say the realities are just out there, and it's our job just to pick them up in the way that a photographic plate would pick something up, or a Geiger counter would register radiation. No, there is an encounter
you.
between our consciousness and whatever else is going on there. And that
Mhm.
encounter is the way in which our consciousness is disposed towards the world, and that is attention. And attention
Mhm.
changes how we find things. And I don't probably need to labor this one, because I know you're very familiar with it, and probably I've talked about it so much on the internet that people are aware of this. But depending on the way in which you attend to um, a natural scene, a person, a body, whatever, depending on the purpose, the context, the you change your attention to it. And when you change your attention to it, two things happen. It changes its nature, and you change your nature. And if you become
Mhm.
habituated to paying a certain kind of um, sociopathically clinical attention to nature, you become more like a sociopath. Um,
Mhm.
Not that it isn't
Yeah.
valuable at times. If you're a good surgeon, you need to be detached in a way. You shouldn't be dealing with you know the issues of this person's life as a present to you at that moment. But nonetheless, as a good surgeon, you should be able to attend to that full person and take into account the meaning of what's going on, their illness, the treatment, and so on for their life. So anyway, that's really just a long way of saying that something is what it is because of the way in which we attend to it. We can only know things the way that we attend to them and they come into being for us. That's the only world we have. So what is important is to be able to pay attention from another perspective and perhaps several perspectives in order to check out things. Am I missing something here? So I believe that the true meaning of objectivity is not a kind of rather diminished kind of relationship with the world in which everything human has been cut out of it. That is not going to bring you closer to reality, because the reality is that we are experiencing it, it is affecting us and we're affecting it. So what objectivity is being aware of the kind of prejudices or biases or partial apprehensions of the thing that one's attending to, and being able to see things flexibly and to be able to think, well, maybe I'm missing something else. And it's this process which I think is so important that is now being disappearing from public discourse, and I don't know that it's being properly taught in schools anymore, which is, that you need to be able to think from different perspectives. Instead, people are encouraged to believe one way of looking is the right one, and that's the one you should have. But I think every time somebody becomes convinced that only this can be right, they need to do the mental exercise of saying, well, what about inhabiting another point of view and seeing if something else comes into reality for me? It may not, in which case at least you've done the test.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of psychotherapeutic work, actually. If we think about the figure amongst the ground and what they're tending to is the figure, but amongst the background, there could be a black bear hiding behind the bushes that, let's say, that they're not really attending to, which can be interfering with their lives. And just because I have a different perspective, I may have the ability to detect that black bear, we could say, and allow them to piece the puzzles. Now, I wanted us to shift over to the matter with things, specifically the second volume. Now, Alfred North Whitehead, he is someone that we are both very fond of, we could say. I actually recently received a gift from a friend of mine, Jason Brown. I actually received a first edition copy of Religion in the Making, of a signed copy of Whitehead's book. I thought was really, really cool.
Lovely.
But in any case, that's just on top of my mind because I recently received it. Thought you might appreciate that. Now, in any case, again, major influence on both of our works. His philosophy emphasized creativity, relationship, dynamism, process. He also introduced the term dipolar to my lexicon, at least. And in his metaphysics, he speculates that mind and matter are part of the same pole, that they're not opposites. In fact, they depend on each other. Even his idea of God at a macro level, right, is a dynamic process, and the primordial nature being mind in the infinite realm of potential, realizing itself through matter. Yet what happens in our physical world further informs the movements in the primordial world. And what I really find empowering about this idea is that humans are now viewed as an agent that has a deeper impact among the universe that we're in. It sort of imbues our lives with more meaning. I'm sharing this for the audience because you already know this probably, but I did want to hear more about how your sort of paradigm fits and does not fit with his ideas that he may have shared in Process and Reality or in other books.
Yes. Well, as you rightly say, he is somebody that I consider one of the greatest philosophers, if not the greatest philosopher over the last 100 years. And he, along with William James and other people such as Schelling and Coleridge and so on, have been very important influences on me philosophically. Although the greatest influence on me is Heraclitus, who was the original process philosopher in the West, anyway, and is closest to Taoism. So, yes, I my obviously I take a long time to work up to a discussion of the relationship between matter and consciousness. But what
Yeah.
I think I can say about it is nobody has come within 100 miles of being able to explain how something like consciousness can emerge from matter that has nothing of consciousness in it. And all the attempts to do so depend on an idea that doesn't really stand up, like complexity. Well, first of all, why would complexity give rise to consciousness? It's another of these hand-waving things in which, and now a miracle occurs because of complexity. But
Right.
as you and I know, the cerebellum has 4 times as many neurons in it as the cerebrum, what we think of as our brain, really, the new brain. And yet the new brain, the cerebrum, is the one that sustains consciousness, it seems. The cerebellum cannot on its own. And I was talking the other day with Mark Soames, who is bold enough to say that the seat of consciousness in the brain is 2 cubic millimeters of tissue in the midbrain, which is, interesting point. But
Periaqueductal gray.
periaqueductal grey. But of course, what even he doesn't claim is that it is the cause or the source of it. Nobody has the slightest idea how it could be a cause. It's just somehow involved in the process of mediating consciousness. And so, I mean, I say there are three ways in which our brains can relate to consciousness. It could emit it. And as I say, nobody has any idea how that could possibly happen unless consciousness unless matter already has somewhat of consciousness in it, in which case they've bypassed the problem by positing at the outset the very thing that is being asked of them. It's a legitimate move, but you're not explaining how it comes out of consciousness. You're just saying it's always been there, which is a position I'm much more open to. And then it could transmit it like a radio set, or it could permit it, which is what I believe. So I believe that the brain is, if you like, a reducing mechanism for consciousness. It is a kind of filter or valve or some kind of processor that allows whatever is. And I believe that consciousness is not just in me, but is in not just other beings, but I think logically the only position I can adopt is that it is part of the ground of being. That, in other words, whatever the ground of being is itself a form of consciousness, and that therefore there isn't a problem of trying to get consciousness out of anything. It is the ontological primitive, and that matter is not necessarily, certainly not distinct from, well, hang on, it's distinct. Let me use my own terminology correctly. It's distinct, but it's not divided from consciousness. I believe it to be a phase of consciousness in the same sense that ice or water vapor in this room are phases of water. And somebody may say, well, consciousness and matter don't look like one another, but neither does the water vapor, the tons of it that are in this room and enable me to remain alive, look at all like the stream that passes my house or the sea that is at the end of the virtually at the end of my garden. So these things, and ice is something completely else. It's solid, opaque, and doesn't move. It's not flowing, and so these things are quite different. And I believe that matter is a form in which consciousness manifests itself, which provides 2 important things. One is resistance. So one of the important things about matter is that it resists my will. I mean, in my consciousness, my will can take me where I wish. But in the material realm, I can't put my hand through the table at which I'm sitting. It resists me. And the other thing is that it gives a degree of permanence or persistence. So resistance and persistence. And so my consciousness moves, and when I've moved on from it, okay, there are traces of memory and so on, but things that are solid and material exhibit themselves in the world for much longer periods, and therefore make it easier to refer to them, to cite common experience of them with other people who know what you're talking about when you specify something material in that way. So I believe that matter is not separate from consciousness. I don't think, however, that means that consciousness always requires matter any more than water always requires ice. It doesn't. It's just one of the forms that it can take.
Right. Well, those are two big differences then from Whitehead's paradigm, at least, because for him the primordial nature was actually unconscious, which I found kind of interesting when I revisited Process and Reality, and then what was the second part that you mentioned? I've lost it. But in any
Yeah.
case, yeah. So, and the fact that matter and mind for him are two parts of the same pole, and you're saying that it's that it just might be another creative form for it, perhaps. Now, I'd like
So
to link
can I
these
just come
ideas.
back on that?
Oh,
Can I just come back
yeah,
on that?
sure.
Um, I don't disagree from Whitehead, but in all conversations about consciousness, one has to distinguish between two very different things. One is the consciousness that you lose when you're in a coma, and the other is,
Mhm.
but you remain a conscious being, and your unconscious can't be there without consciousness, you see what I mean? So unconsciousness is not
Yeah.
the opposite of consciousness. It's a kind of consciousness. So that is a
Mm.
very important point. I was talking about consciousness in the large sense, but he makes the very important point, which I thoroughly agree with and admire, that consciousness is actually a very limiting tool compared with the unconscious. It's coming back to the idea of
Yeah.
intuition that we talked about earlier, that our intuition
Mm.
knows and values things that our conscious mind cannot. And the distinction, he didn't know this, but the distinction is between the left hemispheres spotlight of consciousness on something that is what we are now looking at. We know that that's it. And the consciousness that is sustained in the background all the time, even when we're asleep. And
Mm.
therefore, we have better access to the unconscious mind because the spotlight has been turned off. So I do think that's an absolutely vital point to make. But sorry, carry
Mm.
on.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Well, I was moving on to the idea of God and to Pascal's wager, right? Which is better to believe in God than not to, basically. But I'm more interested in hearing about the McGilchrist wager.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yes, as you say, Pascal's wager had two arms to it. Either there is a God or there isn't. If there is a God, it's very important that you strive to know that God. If there isn't a God,
Mm.
then the attempt to know that God will not do harm; it will do good, if anything.
Mm.
But Mcgilchrist Wager is a third option, a more process orientated option, which is the same
Mm.
two options that Pascal offers, but a third, which is that maybe God doesn't just exist like that as a fact eternally, and nor does he not exist, but in fact
Mm.
comes into a fuller existence, is coming into a fuller existence all the time. And this is a very Whiteheadian idea, although I think I didn't really adopt it from Whitehead as so much as rejoice when I found it in Whitehead, because it expressed for me,
Mm.
I thought, good, he sees something I feel, which is that the purpose of creation, if you like. I mean, one of Whitehead's nicest aperçus is, why have life? Why bother with life at all in the cosmos? If it's about persistence, then the best gambit is never to have lived, because living immediately limits your chances of persisting compared with a mountain or whatever. So, and I think there is a serious answer to this, and it's just worth mentioning that the much more primitive creatures did much better at surviving over long periods. There are, in fact, single specimens of actinobacteria in the depths of the oceans that are 500,000 years old. But when you come forward, you come to the world of mammals. We don't live very long, and even a human only lives on average about 70 years. So
Mm.
this is an energy expensive process that works against the second law of thermodynamics, and ends with a great deal, or not ends, but entails a lot of suffering, Why is it there? I think it is because the conscious ground of being, the creative source that is producing this richness and complexity of the cosmos, and whether you believe in a divine being or not, nobody can doubt that the drift of the cosmos is towards greater and greater and newer complexity and beauty. And this is because the divine essence, whatever it is, comes to know itself through this process, and comes to know itself above all through the responses of creatures that can respond. Now, rock can respond to forces very, very slowly over eons of time, but sensitive, conscious creatures can respond in milliseconds to things, and they can also respond to values. And we started talking about values, and these turn out to be, I believe, extremely important, because I think the reason that there are human beings at all is that they are capable of seeing these values. I think these values are not made up by us. They're not our inventions. They are recognitions or discoveries which we either make or fail to make. And I think that our business in life is to respond to them, to help them to grow, to fulfill them, and to amplify them. That is why we have a role. And again, earlier, I liked very much when you said we have a role to play here. And I believe that very strongly, that we are not pointless, that we can certainly fail to fulfill any kind of purpose in our life. That's up to us. But I think there is a purpose, which is to make things whole and more beautiful than they have become. And you know, there is this creation myth in the Kabbalah in which the final phase is the repair of the vessels, and the repair of the vessels is particularly the job of human beings, to bring together these shards of something that was broken by the ingress of the divine source into the world, shattering the vessels that were supposed to contain it because it was just too powerful. And little sparks of life are still in those shards, and it's our job to repair the vessels. Sorry.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah, yeah. You also made mention of what was it? What were those Japanese objects called that they shatter and they glue them back together? That's a wonderful image that connects with that.
Kintsugi, which is this business of repairing with gold, or yes.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear about. Yeah, I'm really happy to hear about your what you've been sharing about values being a discovery. A big part of what I put in my book, Reassembling Models of Reality, is not the idea that I'm against the idea that meaning can just simply be creative. Like I want to be more courageous, or this sounds good to me. But rather, for me, it comes from self-transcendent experiences, things that have this whole physiological experience of feeling moved in some direction, and then identifying what it was that made you feel moved, and explicating upon what that looks like if you were to continue allowing that to flourish within your life. And so that's sort of a model that I put in the book. So the other thought that came to mind is movement in general in the universe, and the thought of asymmetry as being of great importance for both of us, really.
Yes.
From a biological perspective, maybe one thinks of homeostasis, allostasis. When it's disrupted, it leads to movement. In fact, when I think of equilibrium as a principle in nature, in this Taoist book I'm telling you about that I'm working on, the balance incorporates both the symmetrical and the asymmetrical components to keep life moving, right? Are you in alignment with that?
I am very much. In fact, I sometimes say there needs to be asymmetry. I mean, and that's a point that's supported by Louis Pasteur in talking of biology, and by Pierre Curie in talking about the physical universe. Both of them made the point that the cosmos is asymmetrical in its nature, and that things can exist because of asymmetry. Symmetry may or may not exist, but the important one is asymmetry. Now, actually, asymmetry couldn't exist without symmetry, because you know, otherwise it's just a mess. But we can call something asymmetrical because it has the potential to be considered symmetrical, but doesn't actually fully become symmetrical. But as always, the two poles are not necessarily equal any more than light and dark are equal, or I believe good or evil are. I think there's a dipole. I think they both need to exist, but they're not of equal power. And
Love
I think
and
this
hate,
is
that was a
true.
great example.
Love and hate. And I think that, yes, because hate cannot embrace love, but love can embrace hate. And asymmetry can embrace symmetry, but symmetry can't embrace asymmetry. So these things are very important. But so I say that at a higher level than symmetry and asymmetry, we need the asymmetry of symmetry and asymmetry. So that's what I say about that. And I love very much this point you make about movement for two reasons. I mean, one is to do with a saying of Heraclitus is, by changing, it remains the same. Now, I mean, when I was a schoolboy, I was fascinated by this, but I didn't understand what it could possibly mean. But interestingly, the Greek word used here is metabalon, which is related to the source of our own word metabolism. So in a way, metabolism is always about change, but it's always about enabling the organism to remain itself. So by changing, it remains itself in the way that a river is always changing. Of course, if it stopped changing, it wouldn't be a river anymore. But it remains being that river for, centuries or millennia by changing. So that idea of the asymmetry between movement and stasis is also important. And I just thought also, when we were talking about values, and you said things that move me, I think that's so important, partly because it takes us back to the idea of moral intuition that we were talking about. But also there are two ways in which you can be literally moved if you think about movement in terms of movement through space. One is to be propelled from behind, and the other is to be drawn from in front. And most of the models that we use, almost all the models that we use in science, have been, until very recently at any rate, those of propulsion from behind, a cause and effect chain in which something is given a push and it moves something else and so on. This is the way a mechanism works. But in fact, organisms and all organisms seem to have directions and preferred environments and move in ways that make sense, as it were, and even seem intelligent in that they can find novel ways of addressing a life-threatening encounter that they can't be prepared for, which is an extraordinary fact. But in any case, to come back to human organisms, I believe that we are profoundly moved from in front, from being attracted towards things. And it's very important that the things that speak to us and attract us are the right ones, because there are things that look like good things, but may be very, very dangerous. The Greeks have a wonderful phrase or saying, when God builds a church, the devil builds one right next door. And I believe this is terribly important when one gets into the realm of morality and spirituality, that there are dangerous lookalikes all over the place that can speak to people, and they think that by being, drawn by this, they're going to work good rather than evil, and they may not. So there I go.
Makes me think it makes me think of Mullerian mimicry and Batesian mimicry in the natural world, where certain organisms will legitimately mimic other poisonous animals and others will falsely do so. And so,
yes,
it's an interesting thing. Yeah. Hearing when you said that you were a Taoist, it made me think of I wanted to share a passage with you. You've read the Zhuangzi before, right?
I have, yes.
Yeah, yeah. This one passage reminded me of you, really. I just wanted to share it and hear your reaction to see if you might have the same one that I had. There is a beginning. There is not yet beginning to be a beginning. There is a not yet beginning to be a not yet beginning to be a beginning. There is being. There is non-being. There is a not yet beginning to be non-being. There is not yet beginning to be a not yet beginning to be non-being. Suddenly there is being and non-being. But between this being and non-being, I don't really know which is being and which is non-being. What reactions do you have to that? Although I'm sure you've already read that part now.
Yes. Well, I think it comes back to something that I associate with a distinction to be made between a kind of sequential understanding of a process and a holistic understanding of a process. And one of the things that happened in ancient Greece was that people began to think more analytically, and they therefore thought analytically about a process. And Aristotle has this thing that there's a stationary object, and then it begins to roll or move. At the moment when it begins to move, is it stationary or is it moving? And in a
Yeah.
way, what is being referred to in that passage is that there is a sort of, if you start thinking in this way, you can have an infinite number of not yet being about to be the thing that is. And yet there still is both movement and stasis. There still is being and non-being. Now, quite what is meant by
Right.
the expression which I consider is mischievous. Of these, I don't know which is being and which is not being. I mean, partly because you can actually, in going back to the idea of motion and immobility, you can see each of these as importantly real states. However, I don't think that they are equivalent. They're another asymmetrical pairing, like being and non-being. So
Right.
I think the business of motion trumps, if you like, that of immobility.
Yeah. Yeah, it made me think of two things from your work. One is that, well, something is lost in the whole, really, when we try and break it down into parts, right? And it needs to be reintegrated back in the context of the whole, this whole right hemisphere, left hemisphere, left hemisphere thing. But also this sort of idea of either or, both and but, and both and either or, putting it all together
Yes.
needs to be combined in order for the whole picture to actually emerge. So
Yes.
I just thought
Yes.
that was quite interesting. Um, the one kink that I've been trying to work through actually is because for Taoism, non-being and nothingness tends to be what is more emphasized over the somethingness, and that's that asymmetry that we find in that sort of work. But nothingness is conceived very differently from the Western way of thinking about it. Um, that might be something maybe for a future conversation if you'd be open to it, especially
Mm.
once I work through
Mm.
that with more depth.
Well,
What I
yeah,
wanted.
no, I
Go
mean,
ahead.
I'm happy to go there if you want. I mean, I think one of the things that Westerners find very difficult because of their rather cut and dried way of thinking
Mm,
about things, and I point out towards the end of the Master and His Emissary that it's not quite that the West is left and the East is right hemispheric in its way of thinking, but that the East manages to balance left hemispheric and East and right hemispheric thinking better than West does. Tends to be in the West we tend to overprivilege the left very, very much. I mean, mind you, this is
mm,
historically I'm speaking. Right now in the East, heaven knows what is happening, but it's not, in my view, progress. It's a very worrying recurrence of dogmatism, totalitarianism, total power and control, which is very much the left hemisphere having done a coup. But in any case, emptiness, you see, emptiness does not mean some sort of barren state, which it
yeah.
means to
Not at all.
a Westerner. Emptiness means the opposite of barrenness. It means fertility. It's like the
Mm,
capacious potential space that is the womb, or the hollow of the seed from which the plant will emerge. These are
right.
creative nothingness. And I'm always
Mm,
saying that, there is non-doing and there is
mm,
non-knowing that are,
mm,
as you well know, very important in Eastern thought. But they're not the same
mm,
by any means as just inactivity or ignorance. I sometimes
mhm.
say there's an ignorance before you know, and there's an unknowing after you know. So it's a
Right.
stage of
Yeah.
progress beyond knowing is when you come to unknowing. So I'm absolutely open to the
Yeah.
idea that um, nothing is not understood by Westerners in the way that it would be understood. As I'm speaking out of turn here because I'm not an expert at all, but I have spent a lot of
Mm,
my time reading mystical tracts and the great wisdom
mhm,
literature of the East and finding it
mhm.
resonate with me so deeply.
Yeah. I mean, this is a larger conversation that I'd really be interested in having when I've worked through the problem a little more.
Yeah.
But the idea here ultimately is, as you mentioned, nothingness. A better way to put it is nothingness, right? That there
Yes.
is something that exists there, but it's not matter. Let's say you could think of it as consciousness or infinite potential, and there is movement. And when we talk about stillness, it's not a complete stasis, but it's motion that's much slowed down, one might say.
Yes.
But nothingness, if you look at the Tao Te Ching, they in non-being, they speak of it also as being of utility. If you look at a cup, it's the emptiness in the cup that allows you to fill it up, and
Yes.
so on and so forth. So it's just
It's,
different conceptions. And you walk into a room, a Westerner might look at the things within the space, right? Whereas an Easterner might walk in and they will look at the space in between the
yes.
things to
Yeah.
determine, what the full experience is
It's
actually like.
it's
But
terribly
sorry, the
important.
nothingness
I just want.
allows for. Hmm.
Yeah, no, no. It just
Go ahead.
reminds me of two experiences of mine. When I was 18, I took myself to Italy to go and see the artworks that I'd learnt about and learnt to love at school. And I
Hmm.
remember going into the church of Santo Spirito in Rome, which is one of Brunelleschi's finest churches. And the difficulty is that in a photograph, it looks incredibly dull. It's very sparse and it has these repeating arches. And I went into this building and I thought, whoa, I mean, I feel this space in some very, very deep way. And
Hmm.
the other time when I had this very markedly was in a completely different kind of church, indeed a Rococo church in Bavaria called Vierzehnheiligen. And I've seen pictures of it, and I thought I'd want to look at all the ornamentation and so on. And I went into this place, and again, I hadn't been prepared for the sense of the space, the way it worked on me physically. And it was so intoxicating in both these two very different cases that in each event I had to try and leave and repeatedly failed and had to go back inside to feel it again. And then finally, on my third attempt, was able to leave. So that feeling of I think it's called, isn't it? Of
Hmm.
the space that is between things, which has always
Hmm.
been very a
Hmm.
big aspect of my philosophy. It's very important.
Excellent. Yeah, yeah. It's the absence that allows for the presence, and also absence that
Exactly.
can allow new presences to emerge, right? Such as states of unknowing
We
and
don't
so forth.
understand the meaning of potential, the importance of potential. You know, Heidegger says
Mhm.
somewhere that potential might even be more important than actuality. And as
Mhm.
often he's
Yeah.
provocative and so on, but it's worth not dismissing.
Mhm. I wanted us now to move into some ideas of truth. There's the coherence theory of truth, the coherence of propositions relative to the whole. There's the correspondence theory of truth, right? Truth as it corresponds to facts. There's the pragmatist view of truth, right? Things that can be assimilated, validated, corroborated, verified, what is of use. And it's different from pragmaticism, of course, that Peirce came up with versus James's, which is the one that I think most people think of. But I bring this up because James, he believed truth as in the process of formation, just like everything else. And I think truth as a process is not often thought of or understood in lots of people. And I thought your writings on that were just beautiful. So I was wondering if you could share that with us. Truth as a
Well,
process,
thanks.
and what
Yes,
your conceptions of.
yes. Well, again, to cut a long story short and perhaps oversimplify, but I like to make a distinction between two overarching visions of truth. One is what I call truth as correctness, which is that there is a
Mhm.
truth somewhere, and that when we
Mhm.
haven't grasped this truth, we are in falsehood, and that there is a path towards it, and it is our job to keep moving down this path until we finally encounter truth. And the other
Mhm.
is truth as unconcealing. So it's a process in which truth is less and less hidden by accretions, by veils that have come between us and it through
Mhm.
perhaps no fault of our own, but through the ways in which humanity in general has conceived things and so on. And so it's a clearing away process. One is a building up by putting things together, which is typical of the left hemisphere, and the other is of a movement so that you see something in a new way, which is very much more typical, literally, of the right hemisphere, which is, as you know, the right superior temporal sulcus and gyre is very important for the aha moment in which we perceive something in a new light. So, and Heidegger drew attention to the fact that the Greek word for truth is aletheia, which literally means this unconcealing. So this is, I think, is a very fruitful way to think of arriving at truth. And he also talked about philosophy as like walking through the woods, and sort of not necessarily to a destination, but that the process was the process of coming to an understanding of something. And that sets up in my mind the fact that Aristotle's school of philosophers were called the peripatetic philosophers, because they believed in not just sitting in a seminar room, but actually walking and talking. But in the matter of things, I make distinctions between these ideas in some greater detail, showing how close one is to the way of being of the left hemisphere, and how close the other is to the way of being of the right hemisphere, even down to the vocabulary that we use. That one talks about answering something, responding to something, to resonating with something, to seeing more clearly, or whatever it may be, whereas the other talks in terms of correctness and falsehood and so forth. Is very much more cut and dried and black and white.
Now, there's truth and there's beauty and goodness, right? Beauty is something also that is of really big interest to me. As you mentioned in your book, it's a major issue for science, right? Why is it that, when I look at pictures of abandoned buildings that are overgrown with weeds and, insects and such, I find it so beautiful, right? There's no benefit there that's advantageous to evolution. And when we think about Whitehead talks about truth and beauty as the ultimate grounds for emphasis and prolongation. And so,
Yes.
I wanted to hear more about your opinion about beauty that you could share with the audience, and so I can hear it also.
Oh gosh. Yes. Well, beauty is interesting, isn't it? Because I've always felt that beauty can be deceptive. So there are things that are beautiful, although they make one feel morally uncomfortable. And they can even be rather extreme. So there could be, staged performances that Hitler and his people arranged, and they can be orchestrated in a way that is operatic and in some sense beautiful, but is also deeply, deeply disturbing and sinister. So the beauty is not, the poet Keats said, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. But I'm not sure that we can conflate them in that way, which is probably why we have two different words. But Whitehead, amongst other philosophers that I admire, has taken beauty as the thing that is really the ultimate test, a touchstone. And, that puts me in mind of Dostoevsky, who famously said the world will be saved by beauty. And I suppose that the way I have come to understand that is that in a world where good is so much argued over, and things that we in our guts know to be wrong and have always been thought to be wrong throughout history, pretty much everywhere, are now being exalted, and things that we used to think of as good are now being debased. In a world where truth is up for grabs and it's so hard to separate what has been falsified and so on, the one thing that can't really be falsified is beauty. Beauty calls to one, and it calls to me particularly through great art and through nature. These are the most amazing portals to me of beauty. and of course people as well, and places and so on. But it's probably mainly through art and nature, and through the beauty of certain kinds of life. When you meet people who beauty shines out of them because they've absorbed a sort of discipline into their way of being, which is a kind of spiritual enlightenment. In that sense, I can see how beauty might be said to save the world, and why it might be, as Whitehead seemed to make it, the sort of ultimate arbiter. I'm sure he didn't mean, though, he talked about the aesthetic value, but he didn't simply mean things that were beautiful in the everyday sense. So I
Definitely
think
not.
he was talking about things that expressed various values that we admire. Again, I wouldn't like to be dogmatic about it, and I think that he actually often changed what he meant and said about things. So you can find, as you can in almost any great philosopher, contradictory statements. But the thing that really came home to me was two things about Darwin. One is the number of times the word beauty and beautiful comes up in his writing, and you never hear it in the work of a modern scientist. The awe that Darwin felt before nature is so palpable, and his sense of its beauty is so rich. And I calculated that in the is it in The Origin of Species or is it in The Descent of Man? I really can't remember, but I think it's in The Descent of Man. He uses the word beauty or beautiful on average once every 2 or 3 pages. So it is extraordinary.
Wow.
But he makes this point. Yes, I can say, anyone can say, that a creature chooses a mate because it finds whatever display is beautiful. But what is the beauty? What makes what we call beautiful beautiful? What is beauty? Why is there beauty? Once there is beauty, I can tell you that this will be considered beautiful by a certain kind of bird. This will be considered beautiful by. But what is beauty in the first place? How does it come about?
Yeah.
And that, it's so good that he was a real philosophical scientist in a way that, rather few scientists, I'm afraid, in the world we now inhabit are.
I
I mean, there
thought
are plenty
Plotinus.
that are, but sorry.
Yeah, I thought Plotinus had a very beautiful. I loved his writings on aesthetics and beauty. Plotinus,
Yes.
can you hear me? Yeah, and just using this as sort of example of an architect, and when an architect imagines a beautiful house, where does that come from, right? Before it becomes something that materializes, it's born in imagination, or is shared with them in imagination,
Yes.
permitted it to be expressed in some way, right? So
Yeah, and when you
I
come
think all of
back
that sort of.
to the examples of these buildings I described, Santo Spirito and Piazza in Heiligen, how could, particularly before building Santo Spirito, how could Brunelleschi have felt that space? You can see how he could have drawn a portal, he could have drawn a portico, he could have drawn a spire or whatever. But how could he have conceived a space? But only this space would really feel like this. I don't know the answer to that. It's a miracle. But it must be subtended
Yeah.
by the right hemisphere with its very strong sense of visuospatial three-dimensional form.
Absolutely. So we're almost at time. So I wanted to touch on one more topic, and then, as I do with all my guests, I want to ask you some rapid fire questions,
Okay.
if that's okay with you.
So I
I
probably
wanted to get
sidestepped, but
okay.
go on.
Um, yeah, right. So I want to get your reaction to some speculations I had in my previous book on conscience, and because we are talking about certain ideas that we could say circle what conscience might or may not be. And so the first thing I do is I distinguish it from merely our internalization of parental or societal values, or what Freud might have called the superego. Because I view it deeper than that, because it's in my opinion, it's more of like a truth detector, or a compass, I speak, of course, not of like objective truths, but of experiential truths, which I believe begin as feelings of congruence, right? Things feel right or they do not feel right. Things feel meaningful or they don't feel meaningful. And maybe as it
Mm.
moves up the brain, we can say it evolves into meaningful experiences, into the cortex. We might share them as the involvement of propositional truth values. I was just curious, what are your views on conscience, and does it differ greatly from what I just shared with you?
Well, I like what you said, and I think that in a way, I'd say that we have touched on this when we talked about moral intuition and animals having, in a sense,
Yeah.
a conscience, and that we have
Hmm.
a conscience about things, and that
Hmm.
we can do violence to our conscience, and that may seem to some people to be a liberation, but it is in fact a stunting of something. I think I don't think. I mean, this is hopeless for the last minute or two of a of a discussion, but I mean, I don't think that we can dispense with the concept of the soul. I mean, that's something I have talked about at length, and I think that the soul is something which, again, is not just a given like that, but is something that, as we do, grows and can flourish or
Hmm.
fail to flourish. And again, to
Hmm.
refer to Keats, Keats called this world a vale of soul making. And I think what he was already seeing at the age of 26 or even younger was that we grow this thing. It is a given. It's not just made up, and it's not just, as you say, a set of rules, but it's something that we
Hmm.
have, and that we can nourish it by attending to things that are good and beautiful and true, and that if we choose
Hmm.
not to, or to override it and so on, it will cease to flourish. And
Hmm. Hmm.
without getting heavy or anything, that's pretty big thing, because what have we got to show for our life in this world if we have not responded to what the good things that we've been given and tried to help them
Hmm.
to flourish in whatever way?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, this sort of idea also of where does this sense come from of how we know something is greater or better or more beautiful, and it just seems to be still quite a mystery. This sort of idea of what draws us towards truth and beauty and such. It's just a
Yes, I
very
mean,
um,
yeah, pieces of interesting research. I mean, so babies at 72 hours of existence, when their eyes are only just beginning to function at all, are more attracted to beautiful faces than to non-beautiful faces. And those
mm,
can be faces that are not of the culture of the parents or the baby. I mean, in as much as a baby can conceivably have a culture, but you know what I mean. But they can be faces that are judged beautiful in the culture where they exist. And those faces are more attractive to babies. So that's a very
mhm,
interesting piece of research, because it shows that before any kind of imposition of ideas or words or anything is going to come years later, the baby
mhm,
immediately is attracted to the beautiful.
mhm, mhm. Excellent. Okay, well, Ian, we're at our time. I don't want to hold you for too long. Did you want to sidestep some of these rapid fire questions, or would you be okay to try and answer some
No,
of
go on.
them, sidestep others?
Let's have a go, and
Okay.
then I'll. Yeah.
Okay. Some of these might be torturous for an intellectual like yourself, like this first one I have, which is name a book that you love.
Oh, golly, 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 golly. Um, a book I love.
A book doesn't have to be the book. A book.
Mm. Well, Wordsworth's The Prelude is a book. It's a long poem,
Mm.
but
Okay.
I I would hate ever to be separated from it.
Okay.
But
Name
really,
a
there are
source
so
of
many
inspiration.
books that I would wish to name. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I know. Name a source of inspiration.
Um, golly. Well, I think natural beauty, really. But if you're talking about people, um, William James, who I first came to read when I was about 13 or 14, I read The Varieties of Religious Experience, and I've never stopped reading him since. So he's been a big inspiration.
Wonderful. And what did you want to be when you were a child?
A neurosurgeon.
Oh, okay. And what's your favorite type of music?
My favorite type of music. Ultimately, oh God, this is so torturous, as you say. It's easier to answer since you put the word type in rather than who's your favorite composer or anything. But I think probably
Yeah.
the music that in the end is most exquisite to me is the polyphonic music, particularly the religious music of the 16th century. So that
Mm.
whole genre of Byrd, Tallis, Palestrina, Vittoria, Lassus, Gibbons, people like this.
Mm.
But, there's Bach and there's Mozart and there's Schubert and, but anyway.
Mm. Are you a musician yourself? Do you play any instruments?
Oh, I wish I could call myself a musician. I started to learn the piano too late in my teens. And then
Mm.
I stopped again in my mid-20s simply because I wasn't near a piano. And now my
Mm.
hands are horribly arthritic. I have a piano again, but I wouldn't know how to play anymore, sadly. But the thing I've always
Okay.
done all my life until recently has been to sing in a choir, and that has given me
Mm.
untold pleasure. There is something quite
Yeah.
extraordinarily wonderful about singing in a choir, particularly an a cappella choir, in other words, an unaccompanied choir. So you just have the blending of the
Mhm.
voices. To me, that is exquisite.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, musicians like to say the very first instrument are your vocals, right?
Yes, yes,
And
quite.
if we talk about music developing before language, right, as you've mentioned before,
Yes,
it's like it starts off as vocal, maybe banging on things. But let's keep going here. Do you meditate?
yes. Not very well,
Oh,
but I
okay.
do.
Eastern.
I do. I do sort of mindfulness. This is the only kind of
Okay.
meditation I can really know that I'm doing. But then, you see, I would say that about meditation and about prayer, um, people don't know really when they're doing it. And I'm
Mm.
very pleased to hear that a lot of people that I think are very people with deep spiritual lives say, well, what is prayer exactly?
Mm. Okay. And what is something about you that lots of people don't know about?
Whoa. Um, I talk too much about myself, so it's rather hard to say. Uh, I wish I had some dark secrets to divulge. I'm sure there are somewhere, but what do most people not know about me? I that I fell in love with France. I mean, and Italy and Germany.
Mm.
Um, and Spain. Actually, all these countries, when I first went to them, and Greece, I mean, they really, less Greece actually, which I've got to know better later. But when I
Mm.
first went, I was in Athens and I kind of missed the beauty that I come to love more than almost anything of rural Greece. But I in my teens, I went to France, Italy, and Germany. And in each case, I had a kind of almost life altering experience. It was a rapturous
Wow.
experience in France, and it was a kind of falling in love in Italy. And in Germany, it was a kind of um, an awakening. Like I felt, my God, there's something here that I know about, but I'd studied German at school, but being there, I felt like, my God, is this where I was in a previous life or something? And I have had
Mm.
people supposedly do, ways of discovering a previous life, and the only one I know about is that that I've been told was that I was in the 1860s, I lived in Germany, not far from Munich, and I had a wife but no children. In reality, this time round, I have 3 and some grandchildren, so I'm very happy with that.
Congratulations on that. Funny that your response was that, because the next question was, do you believe in an afterlife?
Well, when one says believe in, well, one has to say, what does one know about the afterlife? And the answer is extremely little. But I would be very surprised if whatever all this is suddenly goes blank and that's the absolute end of it. I believe that there is an afterlife, depending on what you mean by that. So I use this image of us being like whirlpools in a stream. And while we're there, the whirlpool is very obvious. It's photographable, it's measurable, it can move stones, it's real. But eventually it will move on and it will move down the stream. But the whirlpool is not in the stream like an alien being. It is the form that the stream happens to take at that time. And I believe that we are the form that consciousness happens to take at this moment in time. In this part of space, and that it is perfectly real, and that I hope that one is not imprisoned in one's ego when one's life moves on. But I don't think that all that we have experienced is necessarily lost. I don't think it. This is why I say it's important what we contribute in life, because in a way we're contributing back to the very thing that gave birth to us, and we will go back to after this life. We'll know more about what it was we contributed and how that has affected things. So yes, I think in essence I do. Although I also say to comfort people who are very worried about whether what can happen if they die, that there's only 2 possibilities. Either there'll be nothing, in which case I won't be there to be disappointed, or there'll be something, in which case I'll be absolutely fascinated to know what it is.
Yeah, wonderful. Do you believe in aliens?
It depends what you mean by aliens, but I think it's unlikely that there are not other beings somewhere in the cosmos. That's all I could say.
Okay. Last one, but not least. If you could have dinner with anyone living or dead, who would it be?
Who would it be? Oh. Well, it might just be Dr. Johnson, because I'm so fascinated by him, and he obviously was a wonderful conversationalist. He's also a much richer kind of personality than people think. And he also happened to stay in the room I'm in, which is my library. He came here in 1773, and he and Boswell slept in this room. And not many people can say that Dr. Johnson slept in their library, but that's perhaps one of the unknown facts about me. But yeah, I think he would be certainly one, and there are others. Schelling, perhaps. I would like to have known more of him and known what he was like, and yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Iain. It was such a pleasure talking to you, and all of your knowledge and insight and whatnot.
Great pleasure for me too, Aldrich. Thank you very much for suggesting it and making it happen. Okay.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right.